Immediately after finishing my post-spring top 25, I immediately went to work on this video, which is essentially a post-spring Big Ten predictions video. It has a little bit of a different format than the previous one. I have strengths and weaknesses listed as one group on the right side with a letter grade for each position on the field and the staff. You can tell by letter grade which is a strength and weakness. An A or B would be more likely than not a strength. An F or a D, for example, would be a weakness. Or, obviously, the higher grade is a strength, lower grade is a weakness. Just wanted to make that clear. And the schedule, along with assigned wins and losses, is on the left side. Going to be covering all the Big Ten teams, spending around maybe a little above or lower 2 minutes on each team. If you're new to this channel, I encourage you to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, click the notification bell, and comment your thoughts on this video down below. And without further ado, let's start with Northwestern football. The Wildcats are, I think, in for another down year. And it stinks because I think Pat Fitzgerald is one of the better head coaches in the Big Ten, possibly the nation. But he doesn't have the talent all around to make that work. Outside of Peter Skornowski on the offensive line, offensive tackle to be more specific, name me a player for Northwestern. You could maybe include Evan Hall, but exclude him too. Name me a player who has X-Factor capability. And you can't, because Brandon Joseph transferred to Notre Dame, and because Ryan Helinski, despite the fact that I like him, hasn't proven enough yet to be anything close to that. Same with the rest of their players on the team. Defensively, Northwestern looks like a disaster. At receiver and tight end, they look like a disaster too. Running back, the offensive line, mainly because Skornowski, and quarterback are probably the best strengths of the team. And I think to be honest, outside of Pat Fitzgerald himself, the staff is a weakness as well. Their schedule is tough. I have them going 3-9 for a reason. It's not just because of their on-field talent. I think their schedule is one of the toughest in the Big Ten. You got road games at Penn State, Maryland, Iowa, Minnesota, and Purdue, all of whom I have going bowling. More specifically, I have all of them getting winning seasons, 7 wins or more. And Northwestern also hosts Ohio State and Wisconsin and plays in a neutral site game versus Nebraska. If Northwestern goes 6-6, it will be one of Pat Fitzgerald's best coaching jobs of his career. And I'm being dead serious when I say that. The Wildcats are definitely going to have another down year. Illinois will have a down year as well. I have them going 3-9, 1-8 in conference. They're going to be 6th in the West. If you can't tell already, we're starting with the West, going up from there, then going back down to the lower portion of the East Division. We'll close out with the best of the East Division, which is the best in the conference. Illinois, I think they made the right choice in hiring Brett Bielema. He knows Big Ten football, and you see that in his running back room and his trench play at Illinois. Chase Brown is one of the better running backs in the entirety of the Big Ten. Illinois' offensive line and defensive line, more specifically the offensive line, they were challenged multiple times by their head coach. He did not lose them at all. Instead, he gained effort and skill from them. They ran for 300 yards against Penn State. They dominated the ground against several other teams, too. Illinois can, I think, go bowling just by grounding and pounding the football, if we're being honest. They have certainly a higher ceiling than Northwestern has. Good running back room, good offensive line room. Their special teams will be pretty good as well, but they have a lot of questions at wide receiver, tight end, and their quarterback room is one of the worst. It could be the worst in the Big Ten. That would be along with Wisconsin, who we'll be talking about in a few minutes. Their schedule, tough. I don't know if I'd say it's as tough as Northwestern's, who I obviously have Illinois beating, but they play road games at Wisconsin, Nebraska, and Michigan that I think will be very tough, and they host tough opponents in Minnesota, Michigan State, Purdue, and Iowa, and heck, I'd say you could even put Virginia in that category if you were to say tough by Illinois standards. Brett Bielema, it's not going to be his year yet, but I think year 3 or 4, you're going to see bowls, maybe even Illinois contending for the West come November of those years. Up next, we have a team who I think can actually win the West Division in the Iowa Hawkeyes. Illinois and Northwestern, I think, are basically incapable, though you never know. Nothing's guaranteed. They're close to incapable of winning their division. Iowa's capable of winning their division, and it's because of what Kirk Ferentz has done as a coach, along with defensive coordinator Phil Parker. They have one of the better defenses in the country, specifically in the pass defense department. Their special teams are solid, and I know their offense looks lethargic, but it can be annoyingly clutch in moments where it needs to be. They have one of the better O-lines in the country. They have one of the best tight ends, possibly the best tight end in the country, in Sam Laporta as well. Quarterback holds them back. I know it's listed as a C- here, but that's mainly because they have depth. I mean, having Spencer Petras is not a bright spot, but at least if he gets injured, you're stuck with a guy who's similar than him, not worse than him. You have 2 below average guys in the same room. Some teams in the Big Ten have a great or good QB, but if he gets injured, you might have a Graham Mertz level player or worse behind him, for example. Quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and offensive coordinator Brian Ferentz hold this team back. Not a lot of explanation is needed there. Brian Ferentz, I think, is one of the worst offensive coordinators in the country. Iowa, they're always tough to play at home, and I factored this in with the schedule, and they have a lot of favorable matchups at home too. But on the road, they have a lot of unfavorable matchups. You have to play at Ohio State, Purdue, and Minnesota, who I have them all having 9 or more wins. Ohio State, obviously, I have as the best team in the country. Hosting Michigan, they're one of the better teams in the country too. That's going to be a challenge, and I think Rutgers is just an upset. Same thing with Iowa beating Nebraska this year, mainly because Iowa always has their number, even though I think Nebraska is going to be much better than Iowa all around this season. Wisconsin is a very similar team to Iowa as well. I just think that Wisconsin has better talent on offense to get that extra win or 2. I have them going 8-4, 5-4 in conference, placing 4th in the West. They also have a pretty easy non-conference slate. It's the easiest one that we've covered thus far into the video. Paul Chryst, he has hit some bumps in the road over the past 2 years. He hasn't went to Indy since 2019, but he has the defensive coordinator, and I think he's made enough changes on offense to where it will be possible once Graham Mertz transfers away or somehow improves, or more likely than not gets benched, to get there. I think Graham Mertz holds them back. And I'm going to say this here. I think that if they just had a slightly better QB, they would very well place top 2 or top 3 in their own division. And this is including the fact that they have one of their hardest cross-divisional slates in ages, playing both at Ohio State and at Michigan State. They also play at Iowa and at Nebraska. I have Wisconsin only losing games on the road. Their home slate, pretty easy, and the away games they play that aren't the 4 listed are against pretty weak teams. That only one being Northwestern. Offensive line should be one of the best in the country. Running back should be one of the best in the country too by those positions. Quarterback, I think, is the worst, or at least the second worst in the conference, along with Illinois there. Jim Leonard always fields solid defenses as well, and Wisconsin has brought a hefty amount of defensive players through the portal, specifically at the defensive back position, which I think is wise. They weren't strong there this past season, and they lost a lot of them to graduation or the NFL. Wisconsin, I think they're a quarterback away from winning the West, and probably a quarterback and an X-factor wide receiver away from potentially winning the conference. But they don't have those. So therefore, I'm not having them reach Indy or win Indy. Purdue is a team that does have that quarterback, not necessarily the X-factor wide receiver, but they have the quarterback to do what I just said that Wisconsin needs to get to Indy. Whatever. Purdue I have going 9-3, 6-3 in conference. They're going to tie for second place with the Minnesota Golden Gophers. And that gives away the fact that, as many of you know, I have Nebraska winning the Big Ten West, but we'll get to that in a few minutes. Purdue has one of the best offensive play callers in the country in Jeff Brom and Brian Brom together as a duo. It's a really good play calling duo. They know what they know, and it's why they're so good against those top-ranked opponents. It's their excellent pass game that's executed beautifully every time. It's their discipline. It's the play calling. Everything just works so well. Talent is truly the only thing that I think holds Purdue back. You can see that in their run game. You see that on their defense, more specifically, I think the back seven, somewhat of their special teams. But they do have a sneaky good defense. It was one of the better defenses in the Big Ten last year, and that's saying something, as Purdue's not known to be a defensive team. Defense actually won Purdue some games earlier in the year, while the offense took a while to warm up. And Aiden O'Connell, I probably mentioned this earlier, but one of the best QBs in the Big Ten. I think he's the second best, only behind C.J. Stroud. Purdue is a really favorable schedule that will help them out. They play Penn State, at Maryland, and at Indiana. That's their East Division crossover slate. I think that's the easiest out of all the teams in the West. You don't play Michigan, Michigan State, or Ohio State, all of whom I think are better than any of the Big Ten East teams Purdue plays. That really helps them. I think they'll fall short at Wisconsin, at Minnesota, who just have better fundamentals and have the secondaries to take down Purdue's offense, add home field advantage onto that, and those two I think will be losses. And I just think Nebraska will just outclass them in more ways than not, which will lead Purdue to that 9-3 record that I mentioned at the beginning when I talked about them. Minnesota is a much better team than Purdue, I think, but they have an identical record, mainly due to the tougher schedule, which includes at Michigan State, mainly one of the better teams, and a team that I think matches up nicely against Minnesota when comparing the East and West. I think that PJ Fleck this year is going to be a top 4, 3, or 2, somewhere in there, definitely a top 4 Big Ten head coach. I like that he brought Kirk Shiraka back. You have Joe Rossi on defense, who's one of the better defensive coordinators in the Big Ten. Minnesota's main weakness is going to be their front seven. That defensive line is looking pretty weak, a little shallow, and linebacker, despite not being bad, is certainly worse than a lot of other positions that you look at when you look at Minnesota, like defensive back, offensive line, running back. Running back, same with Wisconsin, is one of the better running back rooms in the nation, not just the conference, with Trey Potts, Muhammad Ibrahim, and they had depth in their walk-ons and third and fourth stringers this past season. There's no reason to think they can't this season. And unlike a lot of other Big Ten West teams, they actually have, I think, the receivers who are physical enough to help with their passing game, which is a problem for a lot of Big Ten West teams. I'm mainly talking about Chris Autman-Bell, who could have a breakout year this season. At Michigan State is probably one of their toughest games. I'd say at Nebraska and at Wisconsin are tough as well. I think they'll win on the road against Penn State, just because I think that Minnesota is a better team there. Penn State had some departures from their front seven that I think will help benefit Minnesota's strong run game, which is also the reason I have Minnesota, say, lose to Michigan State. Because Michigan State has a really good front seven. You're going to need to pass against a team like Michigan State in order to beat them. And Minnesota, despite bringing back Kirk Shiraka and Tanner Morgan having a good year before, I'm going to need to see some more improvement before I have Minnesota walking into Michigan State and beating what should be a top 20 Michigan State team nationally. Nebraska, I have as my West Division champion. And I think that, all things aside, I know they don't deserve any benefit of the doubt, because let's be real, they don't. The hires they made and the transfer portal additions they brought in, if the head coach name wasn't Scott Frost, this team would be probably the most popular team in the country right now, because we know how college football fans can be. A lot of bandwagoners. But you brought in Casey Thompson at QB, Anthony Grant at running back. Those additions, plus previous talent at those positions, immediately makes those great positions and strengths. Wide receiver, they don't have a ton of talent there, but it's like Minnesota. It's just enough to where the passing game can function and be good. Tight end, I think, will be better. You got a guy like Travis Vokalek there and others. As long as that room is healthy, it can be good. I think trench play will improve both at the offensive line and defensive line, thanks to portal additions. The linebacker room should be one of the best in the country. Nebraska just seems to be set for success this season. As long as Scott Frost can stay out of the play calling and, help develop his players, especially from a culture standpoint, which I think has been Nebraska's greatest struggle in the Scott Frost tenure, they will be one of the best teams, not just in the West, but in the Big Ten. And their schedule is one of the most favorable in the Scott Frost era. Some of their toughest games, and I would say games that determine whether they go to Indy or not, are home games. Minnesota and Wisconsin, those jump right out at me. Oklahoma, it isn't a conference game, but I think if they win that game, that's one of the better teams they face. They'll be able to win a lot of other games, and it will be a huge momentum boost for them to win that Oklahoma game, which I think they will. That's a home game too, and they nearly beat Oklahoma on the road this past season. So a more favorable schedule than what Nebraska is used to. Tons of incoming talent through the portal. I think they have 14 or 15 portal commits and a massive upgraded staff, which includes Mark Whipple, Mickey Joseph, TCU's running backs coach, and Donovan Raiola from the NFL. I just think Nebraska they're on the upward trend, and it's going to be known, I think, on the Oklahoma game. After that Oklahoma game, that's when the whole college football world will know, in my opinion, that Nebraska is actually a force to be reckoned with. That's the West Division done. We're now going to move to the bottom of the East, conclude with the top of the East, and then just talk about the Big Ten championship game for a minute or two. Indiana, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them, and that's because this past season I thought that they would have a really good year, and they went 2-10. So thanks a lot, Tom Allen. You fooled us all in 2020. I don't think you're going to fool us again. Now, Indiana has brought in a pretty impressive transfer portal class of their own, which includes Connor Bazelak, who I think was the SEC Freshman of the Year at quarterback. That, along with defensive back, which returns Monster Matthews at cornerback, who I think is one of the better cornerbacks in the Big Ten. Those are going to be some of the only bright spots. Indiana, they have no offensive line. They have little to no run game. Their front seven is not as good as it was even this past season, now that Micah McFadden and others have departed. That 3-9, 1-8 conference record, I think, is very realistic. And the 3-0 start, that could build them some momentum, but that part of their schedule is so much easier than the other 9 games. With back-to-back away games at Cincinnati and Nebraska, you return home and face Michigan, play at Ohio State, at Michigan State, which has a different at typo, but whatever. It's still at, it's okay. Indiana just has a really tough schedule. They don't have a good staff. I think Tom Allen is not as good of a coach as we thought he was before, and Indiana just doesn't look to be in a good place. I truly have come to the conclusion that Kalen DeBoer, who is now Washington's head coach, who helped command the 2019 offense that was really good at Indiana. I truly believe he carried Tom Allen to success. But hey, maybe Indiana with that portal class has a better year than I think, and they could very easily prove me wrong. After all, this is just a prediction video. Nothing is guaranteed to happen that I say will happen. This is just, again, a prediction video. No more, no less. Rutgers, who will finish 6th in the division, will be 5-7, 2-7 in conference, and another team that will start off strong but finish without a bowl. I think Greg Schiano is the only guy who really can have success at Rutgers, as his successors, now his predecessors, all failed pretty spectacularly. And it just was horrible. I mean, Rutgers is still very much damaged from those previous head coaches. At quarterback, I think that they have some success going there. They brought in an early enrollee who had some playing time this past season, Gavin Wimsatt. He's very talented. Noah Vedral is not as talented, but you know what you can get out of him. It's more so been the poor offensive line play that has plagued Rutgers. I think the offensive line play will improve. It will still be pretty bad. Wide receiver has some talent compared to the rest of the team. Special teams, and this is including Valentino Ambrosio, possibly transferring away from the program, I think will be one of the best special teams units in the country. They return a lot there. Greg Schiano has really been able to turn around that part of the team the fastest, and it'll show regardless of whether Ambrosio leaves or doesn't. Rutgers is going to have, I think, some success in the near future, honestly. And they do also have a successful, I think, transfer portal class coming in with a lot of offensive linemen there. So if one fails, they can quickly replace the guy who fails. Their early part of the schedule, I think, is easy. I think Iowa is overrated, and a lot of their non-conference teams are just weak enough for Rutgers to beat them. But the rest of their schedule, much like Indiana, is tough as nails. At Ohio State, at Minnesota, at Michigan State, at Maryland, and hosting Michigan and Penn State and Nebraska. All of those teams listed, all 7, are more talented. They have a better staff, and they have better skill position players, those are just the most important features of a team. And for that reason, I don't think Rutgers, despite the fact they'll improve, I don't think they'll go bowling. Maryland is up next. Maryland will go bowling. I think that Maryland will have one of the better offenses in the Big Ten, actually, at least a mid-tier, better graded, specifically passing game offense. I think they have the second best wide receiver core in the conference. Talia Tagovailoa is a great, underrated QB. Dante Demas, Raheem Jarrett, some of the best wide receivers in the country. I think really Mike Locksley is the guy who is holding this team back, but seeing that they're building on offense and those blue chip recruits that they recruited a few years ago on offense are coming through, maybe he isn't the one who's holding them back. Maybe it's the fact that they're still really an ACC team in the Big Ten. They're a team without a conference, a team without a home. But their offensive line also returns all their starters from this past season. They'll be solid there. It'll be one of the better offensive line units throughout, I'd say throughout the Power 5. It won't be one of the best in the nation or even the best in the Big Ten, but it will be a good unit, and combining that with their lethal wide receiver core and good QB play, their offense will be a force to be reckoned with. Their weakness is their defense. A lot of that's due to what I think is a poor coordinator hire there, and also they have a lot of outgoing transfers, especially from linebackers, so they're very thin on defense. Their schedule, they play at Michigan, at Wisconsin, at Penn State. Those are 3 tough road games, but there are teams in the Big Ten with harder schedules. They host Michigan State, host Purdue, host Ohio State. Those are their toughest home games. I think they're going to win one of those games. Michigan State, just because of the issues at secondary, I think is the best. Maryland has the best mismatch against Michigan State compared to the rest of those teams. but that will totally be an upset. I think overall Michigan State's a better team. Maryland, though, bright future. I think if Mike Locksley wants to secure his job even more, give himself maybe a grace year, he has to do it this year, because after this year, a lot of the talent that I think will put Maryland in a great position is going to be departing, especially at wide receiver. Michigan State, tied for third in their division, 8-4, 5-4 in conference. They're going to be tied for third with Penn State, but due to a conference tiebreaker, a head-to-head win that Penn State will have, they will be technically in fourth, but really tied third just behind Penn State. Michigan State's schedule is challenging, but I think really what it comes down to, why they're not going to win 10 regular season games, is mainly because of the mismatches and some of the critical weaknesses they have. Not a lot of teams have as many strengths. They don't have as many A's or highly rated positions as Michigan State does, while also having some glaring, obvious weaknesses that Michigan State does, mostly at the offensive line and secondary. Those two groups are some of the worst in the Power 5, and the rest of the groups are some of the best in the Power 5. It's crazy. And then special teams is kind of in the middle. I think the secondary is going to take a step forward along with the entirety of the defense. It'll be an improved defense, but without Kenneth Walker, and even without him, the running back room will be good. But with what I think will be a similar O-line or a regressed O-line, and without Kenneth Walker, the offense is going to take a bigger step back than most want to admit or than most think. I think that the game against Ohio State will be the least winnable game for the Spartans. They can beat anyone else on their schedule, but I think they're also bound to lose a game or two that no one really expects, and those games would be at Maryland or at Penn State. I think Ohio State is going to be a loss. Same thing with at Michigan. But again, I think they can beat every team on their schedule except for Ohio State. At Washington could be a tough game too. Same with hosting Minnesota and Wisconsin. But I think Michigan State is just, they have better skill position players and they have better mismatches against those teams. Penn State, 7-5, 5-4, again tied for third, but they have that head-to-head win against Michigan State. Penn State is a big problem, and that problem is James Franklin. You cannot get simpler than that. The problem's James Franklin, because their defensive staff is one of the best in the Big Ten. Their offensive staff, I think, they have a lot that can grow. I think that their offensive line coach should be fired, and I think that he probably will be after this season, because I don't see the offensive line improving that much. But it's really James Franklin and the terrible game management Penn State suffers from. And that's why I have them going 7-5. Because Purdue manages games better than they do. Auburn, they might have less talent, but Brian Harsin is a good X's and O's coach. And that plus Southern weather and home field advantage is going to kill Penn State. Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio State, all of their losses have coaches, including some of their wins. In fact, most opponents on Penn State's schedule have better game managing head coaches than James Franklin does. What I think saves Penn State this year from going either 500 or under is their talent and their defensive staff. I think it declined under with Manny Diaz coming, Brent Pry departing. It's still a really good defensive staff, one of the better defensive back rooms in the Big Ten. Penn State also has a really good wide receiver core. They have options at QB and running back in case one doesn't work out. They have good tight ends with Bretton Strange and others. And their defensive line, linebacker core, it will be good. So Penn State's talent and assistant coaches will really help them in comparison with some of these other schools. I think that they'll start off really slow. You see that I have them starting 3-5. But that talent and some of those younger immediate impact freshmen who I talked about in a video about Penn State, I think you'll start to see them have an impact on the team, and that's why I have them going 4-0 in November. Plus, their November slate it's really easy, and they have nice mismatches with a lot of those teams. Michigan, Second in the East, I'd say second in the conference overall, 11-1, 8-1 in conference. Michigan is primed for another successful year, and if they win the Big Ten, I would not be all that shocked. They have the head coach to do it. I don't think Jim Harbaugh is the top 2 head coach in the Big Ten this year, but his assistant coaches, the staff he's built around him, is one of the best staffs in the country. Their QB room, you have Cade McNamara and you have J.J. McCarthy. That is one of the more solid QB duos in the country, especially speaking from depth. They have one of the best running back rooms in the country, one of the best tight end and offensive line groups in the country. Their special teams, also one of the best in the country. Michigan is poised to once again be a playoff contender and possibly a playoff team. Their defense will take a step back. I think that they had one of the better defenses in the country this past season. Their pass defense will take a big step back. I think their run defense will take a slight step forward, and that's where you get all the A-minuses at their defensive positions. They brought in some transfers, only 2, but those 2 transfers essentially plugged up any potential holes. Cam Good plugged up the depth at defensive tackle, and Oluwatimi just helped build a great offensive line to possibly be even better than this past season. Michigan's schedule is also cupcake easy. And when you have Blake Corum and Donovan Edwards at running back, Eric All at tight end, Oluwatimi, Ryan Hayes, and others at offensive line, this schedule's just, it's easy. It's cupcake easy. I cannot describe to you enough how easy of a schedule this is and how many of these teams match up poorly with Michigan. Michigan's toughest games are at Iowa, Michigan State, Nebraska, and Ohio State. In order, I would put it Ohio State 1, Michigan State 2, Nebraska 3, Iowa 4. I think they're winning 3 out of those 4 games. They want that shot to beat Ohio State again. They really want to beat Michigan State too. But I think they'll fall short in Columbus because Ohio State has more talent, they have the better head coach, and it's a road game. All those factors put into place, it'll be a very tough ask for Michigan to beat Ohio State again. And speaking of the Buckeyes, here are the Buckeyes. 12-0, 9-0 in conference, first in the East. I think they have one of the best head coaches in the country. Yes, he has kind of ridden off of Urban's recruits, some of Urban's assistant coaches, but at this point, if we're being honest, who cares? He's given them raises to keep them here. He's owned it at recruiting. He has poached whatever coach, whether head coach, coordinator, who knows? He's poached whoever he wants to help improve his team. I think that their staff, QB room, running back room, wide receiver room, offensive line, and defensive line room are some of the best in the country. And having that many rooms that are some of the best in the nation, like I just mentioned with Michigan, but even more here with Ohio State, means you are a playoff team, a playoff contender. And I think Ohio State's going to go undefeated. They're going to be the only Big Ten team to go undefeated in the regular season, one of the few teams in the nation to go undefeated in general. And their schedule, despite it being easy, because Ohio State, if we're being honest, is much better than all of these teams, and the teams that come closest to them, like I would say, probably Michigan and Notre Dame, if I remember correctly, they host them. They don't travel to them. They host them. But it's a great resume schedule. Even though it's easy for Ohio State standards, that's a lot of ranked opponents Ohio State's probably going to face, like Notre Dame, Wisconsin, at Michigan State, potentially Iowa and Penn State, especially Michigan as well. Those are a lot of potentially, more likely than not, ranked teams that Ohio State will face and beat. I have Ohio State as my number 1 team and my national champion, which many of you already know, and I think just them having the best offense in the country and their defense certainly stepping up will help that. Their linebacker room, watch out for that though. I think that's going to be their glaring weakness. It won't be a bottom linebacker room in the country or even in the Power 5, but it won't be up to par with a lot of other Big Ten linebacker rooms. So we've discussed the different divisions, my opinion and prediction for each team, we're now going to talk about the championship game, which I think Ohio State will win that game over Nebraska. Ohio State will be 13-0, 9-0 in conference, entering the college football playoff. Nebraska will be 10-3, 7-2 in conference, probably going to the Citrus Bowl or possibly reaching a New Year's Six Bowl game as the third overall team in the Big Ten, likely behind, well, in this case, definitely behind Michigan, as Michigan would have one loss, one more win. Nebraska would have one less win, two more losses. This game would be competitive, I think, for a few quarters, but at some point, Ohio State would just take over. Ohio State's better than last year's Michigan team, I think, this season, but Nebraska this year, I think, will be a much better team than Iowa this past year. This championship game should be entertaining, but I have a hard time believing that Nebraska even has a decent chance at beating this Ohio State team. Competitive for 1, 2, maybe 3 quarters, but definitely by the fourth and possibly earlier, like in the third, or even before halftime, you'll begin to see Ohio State's talent, stamina, just pull away. They'll keep chugging away, and eventually it will show. I think that they're the best team in the conference. You could also put, for example, Michigan here, and if they face Nebraska again, I'd have them win as well. I think that the East is just so much superior to the West. There's so much imbalance, and it's obvious. Nebraska is in a wide-open West division, if we're being honest. I think this is the most wide-open the West has been in quite some time. They're going to take advantage of it. I think they're going to be a top 15, top 10 team. I have them as my number 10 team personally, and they're going to be really good, but they're nowhere near. There's a wide gap between Ohio State, who I have as my number 1, and Nebraska, who's my number 10. Nebraska plays in the much easier division. Ohio State has, I think, a similar schedule by toughness, but they have a better resume schedule. Their schedule better prepares them for facing tough opponents than Nebraska's schedule, and so forth. So Ohio State will win the Big Ten, Nebraska will be the runner-up, and Ohio State and Michigan, possibly Nebraska, maybe someone else will reach a New Year's Six Bowl or something very similar to that. But that's just my thoughts on the Big Ten championship game, and this is where I am going to end this video. Again, if you're new to this channel, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, click the notification bell, and comment your thoughts on this video and tell me your Big Ten predictions down below. Who do you have winning the Big Ten? Who do you have going to Indy, and why? Tell me that down below. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys around. Bye.